Welcome on board, Allan. Thanks for joining us. Great to see you.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Allan, let's start with a quick baseball card intro. We'll take it from there.
All right. So I've been in cyber for 20 plus years, been in high tech for 30 plus years, been a CISO 5 times now. I've got a very strong history with product security. I actually left IT years ago and went to engineering and built a product security program at a video conferencing company. Came back to IT and brought product with me in my very first CISO role, fusing the two disciplines and doing enterprise security and product security all in one go. So since that time, I've always had a real bent towards product and towards services. I've done the data services industry as well, and I've always had a fairly strong customer focus in all my roles as a CISO as well.
That's wonderful. So let's start with some embarrassing question. A little bit of different way of starting might be. Huh? So what had been, Allan, the most embarrassing moment in your cybersecurity journey, especially in the context of presenting to the board or reporting to the board?
So the first time, let me back up and start with this. People talk all the time about the CISO going before the board, seeking budget, seeking money. And it's actually been my experience that that's actually a very rare thing. Normally, budget is allocated and designed more at the CEO level. The board is just there to see that the operational stuff is happening and measure efficacy and success. And, hey, we gave you X money, what have you done with it? But you're not necessarily going to the board asking for more money. The one time that I actually had to do that, it was a joint presentation with my CEO, who was trusting me and relying on me to cover the cyber pieces of the game. And we went before the board seeking more money, and I got torn to pieces. I was nowhere near as prepared as I thought I was. I had prepped for, here's what we want to spend the money on, here's why we need to spend the money on it, here's how much money it will cost, here's what it'll give us, and I had focused on the ask and everything moving forward with it. And what I didn't anticipate was them going backwards in time and outward in their questions and asking about everything around it and basically demanding to know, why do you need new money for this? What have you done with the old money? Weren't you working on this other thing? What happened with this? Where's the data for that? And the questions just came flying in, and the more questions came flying in, the more obvious it was I wasn't prepared, and the more awkward I got, and the more I got, and it did not go well. It was a hard lesson learned in how not to present to a board.
Yeah, that's very interesting, Allan. In fact, my experience had been something very similar. I had not one, but many such moments with the board. And interestingly, it took me a lot of time to even understand that I had a bad board meeting. So to start with, when I did my first startup, that was right out of my school, we raised some VC funding, etc. So I had no clue about what a business is and how a business run, etc. So it took me a few years to just understand that my VCs and board member had been extremely generous with me. So much later, I realized that what is the function of the board? In the early days, I did not even understand well that what does the board want? What are they looking for? At what level do they want to engage? And that question, that what does the board want, is very much similar to what some of those elusive things which we sometimes try to find out, what we as human beings want, what men want, what women want. It's not a fixed answer, right? There are many answers to this question, and depending on the size of the company, the maturity of the company, the nature of the board member, the answer is very different. So in my initial few years, I did not even realize what the board is looking for. It took me much longer to understand these are the board priorities. So once I kind of understood this part of my board members, I did much better. But my early days, a lot of times I went in as a techie talking about product and technology, whereas the board was looking for something else altogether.
Yep.
So Allan, what had been, I know we talked about this, more of this on the other side where things did not go that well. What about some of those successful ones. So why don't you share something about one of your most successful board meetings as a CISO, and then after that we'll go dive and dissect the board meeting in terms of what should you do before the board meeting, what should you do during the board meeting, after the board meeting. So we'll go deeper, but before we go deeper, let's discuss one of your successful board meeting. How did it look
Okay.
like?
So to your point, every board is different. And some boards have a security subcommittee and some don't. Some boards have a strictly business view, and some actually, to your point about being a techie, I've seen some boards where some of the members actually did appreciate a little bit of the techie, not a lot of it, but a little bit of the techie perspective. And I got a good relationship established with a board who did have a security subcommittee, and the head of that committee did understand the technicals more. And so what began as broad strokes and more of a storytelling approach with data here and there turned into I could actually disclose more of the data and get into more of the details with this board committee than I had suspected I could. And it made my job so much easier because where I lived and where I operated, normally I was having to step up to the business level, translate, come back down to the technical level, step back up to the business level, and always be jumping back and forth between these two realms of thinking. And I was able to fuse the two disciplines a little better with this particular board, this particular committee. And as a result, really rapidly won their respect, got a good rapport, and got to the point where I looked forward to my board meetings. There was no fear anymore. So that was probably my best experience. And again, it ties into what they're looking for. I'm a big believer in you have to have a good storytelling capability regardless. Start with the story, populate with the data, and what data you present has to be geared towards their level of expectations, be it a very business-oriented view, which is what you should always start with, or perhaps a bit more technical, which is what you should assume you don't start with, in my mind.
That's very interesting. So let's move to the main part of our discussion, which is, I would say, these three things, like how do you prepare before the board meeting, and then what do you do during the board meeting, and what's the follow through. So let's start with part one, that is preparing for the board meeting. And we can slightly extend it in the sense that not every CISO goes and presents to the board, right? So, but most of the CISOs would present to the management team and the CEO or the CRO and the CFO, etc. So let's keep both of those in mind, even though the question is more around the board, but we can also kind of consider or extend it slightly even for the management of the meeting with the CEO. So how would you prepare for that board meeting? What are some of those key things which you love doing?
Yeah, so I would assume, first of all, that I've met the board before. We won't talk about the very first board meeting. We'll talk about once it's an ongoing process. So slide one for me is always very simple. Where were we the last time we talked? Where did we get to? What did we spend to get there? And basically what you're doing is you're showing proof that the last investment was a payoff. Last time I was here, I told you I was going to do X. I told you I would spend Y to do it. And here I am proving that X got done and I spent Y or less to do it. And maybe even also the timeframes involved, depending on how operational the particular board cares to get. But the net is we addressed a high level concern. We addressed it on budget and on time. Here's the proof that what we did last time works. And then my second slide would always be just the list of the outstanding top 5 business risks. Here's now what we face. And then number 3 would be, here's how we're going to tackle what we face, and here's my commitments. So at the next board meeting, what I said I'm doing in slide 3 becomes the slide 1 at the next meeting, and you're just perpetually cycling through. Here's what I did for you. Here's what we're facing. Here's what I'm going to do for you. And then the next meeting, what I'm going to do becomes what we did, and on and on. And you're demonstrating your success. You're demonstrating your operational efficiency. And then we get into how are we expressing this, like business terms. So it really boils down to what the business is looking for. I think most boards understand and respect maturity audits. You bring in an outside firm and you do a CMMI style maturity audit, and they assess the whole organization and come back and say, on a scale of 1 to 5, you guys are currently a 1.7. and you come in front of the board and you say, all right, I was a 1.7, and our target goal is a 3. And we believe with the budget we've set forth and the operational goals we've got that we can achieve 3 within X, time units. And so by the next time I report to you, you'll see that we've jumped from 1.7 to 2.5 or whatever, whatever the goals are. So maturity scores to me are a great and fantastic way to start communicating with the board at a high level. I mentioned specific business risks. I'm a big believer that also needs to be on the table. And more importantly, something a lot of CISOs don't think about because they're so busy worrying about the security and worrying about the risks is business objectives. Every business has stated business objectives for the year. And those objectives might be things like accelerate time to market, for example. It's imperative to me that my security story always be contextualized in those business goals. The board is familiar with the business goals. The board knows where the business needs to head and what the goals are for that year. And if accelerate time to market is a goal, then I need to demonstrate that whatever security practices I put into place, whatever security I operationalized, ties to those business objectives and ties to that goal. So I can demonstrate how whatever we did application security and improved and streamlined our ability to get whatever application, getting our quote to cash for our customers. We improved streamlining security with that. Whatever your operational challenges and targets may have been, and whatever your successes are, tie them into those business objectives is another key mantra for me. And then we get into the individual metrics from there, which I can ramble about for hours. So you've been on some boards, and I would love to hear your experience as the board member, receiving the CISO's message, hearing it in terms of business objectives, hearing it in terms of risks and maturity. Like what sorts of perspectives have resonated with you as a board member?
Yeah. So Allan, you had been one of the very few persons who spoke about tying these business objectives and using that as a language. And then I think that's something very vital. Like I had been more on the other side as a board member, and now the CISO reports to me. Now, few things which I have generally seen kind of lacking is that most of the times the stories come around like we need to have DLP and we need to have SOC or we need to do pen testing, that kind of stuff. But moving to the business objectives, so understanding the business objectives like what you mentioned, I think that's a very vital point which you mentioned. And if you look at some of the companies, what are their top business objectives? The top business objectives, depending on the company, could be increase the annual recurring revenue, reduce customer churn, or certain other aspects. Now, the moment you connect something to the churn, or if we don't do these things, then that could affect customer churn, because if something like this happens, that will cause our customers to leave. Or
Right.
we want to grow our annual recurring revenue, and in the RFPs which we are getting, everybody has got this third-party cybersecurity risk management program, and in every cybersecurity risk management program, organizations are asking for these 3 things. If we don't do those 3 things, we will not be part of the RFP.
Right.
We will not qualify. Now look at this. Instead of saying that if we don't do DLP, we can get compromised. These are 20 people who are 20 organizations who got compromised, or we should do the red teaming or pen testing, etc., etc. Changing that narrative to if we are playing part of this kind of RFPs, this is a common requirement which we have seen. Now that is something which is a lot more kind of appealing to the board member. So this is a great point which you mentioned, Allan, which most of the times I see is missing. Most of the time,
Right.
the narrative is very technical. So that's a great point which you mentioned. So let me ask you something on this. Like, how do you build these stories? Because at the end of the day, I remember when we had been speaking earlier, you mentioned about it's all about stories, right? And I'm a firm believer of that. I mean, it's not about numbers, it's all about stories. So I'm a believer that it's the heart decides and sends the brain to make the decision.
Yep.
Or to prove that point, right? So your heart first makes the decision and as the brain prove that. So
Right.
using the same set of data point which you gave, a person could either decide in favor of you or use that same data to go against you. It just
Right.
depends on how that guy wants, right? So how do you capture the heart of the board member? How do you tell those stories? So tell us a little bit about how you kind of craft those stories, and how do you communicate those stories to the board member or to the management?
Right. So I guess I always start with the old classic once upon a time, right? Once upon a time, we were here. And we knew we had issues, and we knew we were carrying security risks, and we knew that information security was high on our risk chart. We even acknowledged it in our 10K. We put forth an idea that information security risk was a business risk that needed looking at, and that's where we began. And showing the journey, showing the progress, showing how that tracked to business goals and objectives, showing how individual high-level risks were remediated and addressed, showing how the maturity story got from A to B. Gartner has a maturity curve that's very interesting. It's I think of it as kind of a poor man's CMMI. But the reality is it's actually interesting in its own right, because it has critical milestones in the security journey for a company. For example, CISO appointed is a milestone on that Gartner curve, and it's important to me to give the board credit where their credit is due, to give the business credit where the credit is due, as we talk about where we were and how we journeyed through. Obviously, this was done with wins. This was done with winning a new business objective met, winning a new reduction in critical risk, winning a new client over because of security. Having successful business outcomes based on security as a key business differentiator. Whatever the positive stories are, share those stories and give the credit to those stories. And once that narrative is on the table, and once that story is on the table, you can then dip into the data points, right? We were able to win this deal. We won this deal because of security as a differentiator. And then you can tie it back to, remember last time I was here before you, I said I was going to go accomplish X. Well, we accomplished X, and it's directly related to this new stream of revenue. And always tying it into the business's top line, bottom line, business objectives, known high-level risks, known maturity posture, known milestones. Have all of that at the ready, and only use your actual metrics and data to complement and pepper in the telling of that story. And that's kind of my approach.
That's interesting. That's interesting. So one thing, Allan, before the board meeting, which I try to do, is if there is something which is a really very big bad news, I would share it way before the board meeting.
Yes.
I mean, I wouldn't wait until the board meeting and share it, because in the board meeting, I don't want to give them negative surprises. That's one. The second
Right.
thing which I have also done, which has helped me, which I did not do in the early days, was, now for all CISOs, you may not need to do that because it's more of the role of the CEO to make this happen. But this is something which CEOs typically would do. If there is a major decision that needs to be taken, it doesn't get I mean, such kind of decisions are not generally made during the board meeting. It happens beforehand.
Yep.
So as I mean, if you are the CEO or if you are one of the key stakeholders, you have to talk to the board members beforehand and get them aligned, because board meetings are generally very short. You
Yes.
can't achieve that kind of I mean, key goal or key decisions to be made, which has a lot of complexity. So if such kind of stuff is there, it needs to be done beforehand.
Yep.
So if it is kind of business as usual, you don't need to kind of talk to them beforehand. But if it is not, even if it is with the CEO, I think it's a great idea to kind of prep things beforehand and prepare for those major, either big bad decision, big bad news has to be shared early, or some big kind of even good stuff, even if it is a big plan which you need people to ponder upon, etc. Preparing them in advance. I mean, Allan, I guess you like you're a Texan, right? You
Yep.
love barbecue.
Yes.
You have to marinate well before to have a good
Exactly.
barbecue.
Exactly.
It
That's
has to
exactly the
happen
metaphor.
before. So you need to do that before. That's another very
Yep.
important part of I think the board meeting presentation,
Yep.
or any CEO presentation. One thing which I really loved, which you mentioned about, there are only 3-4 key things which you mentioned about, right? Like having the plan versus achievement, and the showing the business risks, and what's the plan, and next time start with I mean, we planned this and we achieved this, right? And also you spoke about the maturity scores, kind of stuff. So how many slides do you typically have in a board presentation?
So it all depends on, to your point, how often I'm reporting directly to the board, right? If they want to meet the CISO and they want to have a CISO conversation, it could be as many as 5 slides. I try to stay to 3, but it could even go to 5. If I am simply submitting slides upstairs for someone else to present with the CISO's material just being part of a greater presentation, it could be as low as 1 slide. It really depends on how active a role the board wants in the cybersecurity piece of the business. And to your point about letting them know in advance, we started with one of my embarrassing stories. I'll tell you, one of my hardest lessons learned in business was exactly that lesson, and not just with the board. Your advice to make sure they have the material ahead of time, especially if it's a surprise or bad news or whatever. Yes. And I would argue that advice applies to the entire business, right? In other words, even your peers. The very first time I found myself reporting on the rest of the organization for security to the highest levels of leadership in the company, I had come up with the clever idea of gaming, making it competitive, demonstrating who had the best security scores and who had the worst security scores. I call it the Hall of Fame and the Wall of Shame. And this was a good idea. The leadership liked it. The heads of the company liked the idea of gamifying it. The challenge is the first time I presented, I didn't bother getting with my peers and letting them know, by the way, you're in the Hall of Shame and you're about to look really bad in front of your boss. I just measured it all. I put the charts together. Here's the good and here's the bad and here's the ugly. And I threw it in front of everybody live in real time in that meeting. The number of phone calls I got back, this was very early in my career, the number of phone calls I got back, the number of angry emails I got back, like it backfired completely. And it took a long time to recover from that, to win their trust and win their hearts and minds and get the gaming nature back on the table in a positive way. And measuring these things through, we talk about specific metrics and things that we haven't really stepped into yet. We've kind of been alluding to. One of my favorites is the organic variance chart. The idea that you can demonstrate where we were last time and what the deltas are from last time, positive or negative, broken down by whatever you're wanting to break down, business unit, team in the company, whatever it might be. And this idea that, hey, last time we were at this various level of security, and now this team has done so much better. This team has done a little worse. This team has stayed flat. Having that in one pretty chart is a useful metric for me. I love to have organic variance charts.
Okay, great. So, Allan, we spoke about preparing for the board meeting. We talked about the structure of a board meeting, and one thing which I really love is you mentioned about just 3 or 5 slides at most, and even lesser number of slides. So one thing which I commonly see is CISOs coming up with a huge number of slides and a lot of content on the slides, which is very hard for a board member to consume. So that's a great thing which you mentioned. So let's talk about a little bit during the board meeting. So how do you, how long is a typical board meeting, and how do you kind of play through this entire board meeting? You go with those slides. So what had been some of your experiences in terms of this works well, this doesn't work well, and this is how I do what I do?
Okay, so to your earlier point, you definitely want to provide the materials ahead of time, even if there are no surprises. I try to present the materials a good week ahead of time and give every member of that board a week to ingest it, come up with their questions, come up with their ideas. By the time I'm presenting to them, they should be completely familiar with the material already. And so in my mind, my presentation is the least important part of the experience. The more important part of the experience is them asking questions. And so I will present a little bit. Here's slide 1. Here's the high level overview. Here's the highlights I want you to hone in on. And especially when you're only down to 3 slides, your story of where we were and what we did, your story of what we face, and your story of where we're going next and what it's going to cost us to do it. If you stick with that sort of approach and stick with that narrative, you may find that the board wants more local color. When they ask questions, they may ask questions about, well, I read about this SolarWinds thing, or I heard about this Colonial Pipeline thing, or I heard about Equifax or Home Depot or Target or Sony, or whatever time period you're talking about, whatever kinds of cyber concerns hit the big news. If you have a board who's interested in current events, then maybe that's where slide 4 goes in. You highlight the big current event, and you highlight how you as a business are already prepared for that, tackling that, approaching that, or tie it into your last slide of here's where we're going and why we're going, and tie it into that same narrative. If you have a board that asks those kinds of questions, be prepared to answer those kinds of questions. Assume that whatever you present is going to be taken apart, and assume that there's going to be some pointed questions about cost, about overhead, about is this really saving us what we need to save? Is this gaining us what we need to gain? And be prepared to have those kinds of conversations. And your actual presentation should be very brief, and the Q&A session should be more of the time. And as to the length of the board meeting, your first question, I've seen all over the map. I've seen board meetings go from as little as 2 hours to as long as a full day. But my piece of it as the CISO, 15, 20 minutes on average. And so you have to be able to get in quickly, get your ideas across quickly, and be prepared for that Q&A.
Absolutely. So, and Allan, you mentioned one great point. I think this is something which a lot of times people miss out, especially in the early meetings, that is knowing about the board members well. You have to know the board members well and anticipate that this is the guy who might ask this kind of questions, right? And be prepared for that. That's a very interesting point that you mentioned, and I wanted to kind of bring that out. So if there are some of the metrics which you are presenting to the board, what are some of the metrics which you bring up?
So, first and foremost would be that maturity score. I always lead with that because it's the highest, simplest measure of the whole business, of the whole structure. All of what we're doing for security rolls up to this maturity score. It's a great summary metric. So here's where we were, here's where we are, here's where we want to be. Always have those three perspectives ready with the maturity score at all times. The next one would be business objectives met, and a very brief chart that shows how we've aligned with, achieved, accelerated, contributed towards various and sundry business metrics. If
Can you give us a few examples, Allan? So this is a very interesting point which most of the CISOs find it hard, right? So can you share some examples of here is a business metric and this is how you connected security with it?
Right. So I think before I said accelerate time to market is a good example. Stand out ahead of competition is another good example of a business objective I've seen. Achieve operational efficiency is oftentimes a business objective. Usually it's those types of phrases and ideas, and it's usually about top line or bottom line, and it's usually about the focus for that particular quarter or that particular year. It's usually annual in my experience. And if it's a bottom line approach that they're really wanting to impact, they may talk about operational efficiency. So you have to demonstrate how what you did in security directly aligned with that goal of operational efficiency. You can speak to, hey, we rolled this out in a very operationally efficient manner, but ideally and more importantly, you can demonstrate how your security project helped the business with its greater operational efficiency goals. Let's say
share some example of that.
Yeah. Like let's say that you had a massive rollout of zero trust. You've got a work from home population, COVID hits and suddenly everybody's working from home. And to improve operational efficiencies, you've got to have everybody working from everywhere and be capable of working from home. And that first initial hiccup of sending everyone home, you probably had some issues and challenges. Well, you come along as the CISO, implement a very clean zero trust strategy. You get a SASE rollout, or maybe it's more VPN concentrators, and whatever changes you made from a security perspective, you can demonstrate directly this project in security, which costs us this much money and lowered these risks, also tied to this business objective of operational efficiency. We had a massive rollout of work from home, zero trust, SASE, whatever kind of plays you might have. There's one example where you can actually tie specific security projects to specific security, specific business objectives. Other times it may be a little more subtle than that, where you're not necessarily operating at the project level, but you can highlight key technology achievements. And this is one of those moments where I do get technical and I do dive into the techie stack. MFA, multi-factor authentication. It's a 30-second explanation to the board what MFA means. And then you can immediately demonstrate how by placing it here and here and here and here in the business, these people are now accessing these systems more quickly. These people are now able to log into these systems securely and safely. Customers are using it. Whoever is using it, you've got all the stories that you need to demonstrate how this one technology deployment tied to various business objectives of accelerate time to market, operational efficiency, et cetera. So sometimes you may actually dive into a technical detail. More often than not, I try to keep it at the project level. And as I speak to a project, back to slides 1 and 3, here's what I did. I'm also trying to tie that to the other elements too. So when I speak to a project, I will show how it ties to business objectives, but I will also show how it ties to risk. And I will also show how it ties to maturity score, and keep the 3 legs of that stool on the table at all times. So generally speaking, anything I bring up in front of the board will have those 3 aspects to it. Business objectives met, known risks reduced, and security maturity improved. And generally, regardless of technical or project level perspective, when I speak about my operations, I'm going to tie to those 3 things.
Allan, that's a very beautiful thing that you mentioned. I never heard something like this in this manner. So these are the 3 things that you connect anything with these 3 things. So let's pick up an example, and SASE and Zero Trust. You spoke about that. Let's pick up a different example. Like, for example, if you have to build a SOC.
Mm-hmm.
For Security Operations Center, you might just tie it up with the risk and maturity, but may not be a business objective. Is that right? So it's not necessary every project will be tied with all 3. It could be a specific project might be tied to only 1 or 2. Is that the right understanding, Allan?
That's a fair assessment, and you can't do it every single time. Sometimes you're standing up things that are very much aligned with risk and maturity, and not with a specific business objective. But I would argue that a chart in your slides showing at least partial alignment with business objectives can be worthwhile. So a SOC, for example, obviously the highest risk is not having visibility to what's going on. We stood up a SOC, now we have visibility. We've addressed a key and specific business risks. Dealing with the unknowns is a risk, right? You can tie that into your specific maturity score on the Gartner model, on the CMMI model, on COBIT, ITIL. I don't care who you are, CMMC. Everyone's going to have a maturity model that says knowing what's going on is a vital step in your maturity. That one's easy. Now, tying that to business objectives, you can point out partial overlaps. Let's say that the business has declared 3 or 5 total objectives, and you've got to accelerate time to market, improve operational efficiency, stand out against competition. Whatever these various goals might be, if you can demonstrate that the SOC partially adheres to or aligns with 1 or more of those, it's worth exploring putting that in front of the board. If it's a very soft alignment and you really are stretching the truth to say this one aligns, don't do it. But if you can demonstrate overlap, why not? A partial alignment with a business objective is certainly better than no alignment at all.
Yeah, and in some cases you can make it business aligned, like SOC for an e-commerce company, you can extend it to prevent frauds.
Exactly.
And that's directly connected to your bottom line or the top line of the company, right? And so bottom line of the company, it impacts there, right? So you are directly helping in the business. But a SOC for a non-e-commerce company sometimes might not directly benefit the top line or the bottom line, right? So sometimes you might be able to connect, sometimes you might not be able to. But this strategy, which you mentioned of connecting every project with at least 1 or few of these 3 objectives, I think this is a beautiful idea, Allan. I never heard this in this manner before. Thanks for sharing this. I guess our community would find this useful. So any other thing which you would like to add, which has really helped you during the board meeting or during the management meeting?
I've learned more about what not to include than I've learned about what to include.
Let's talk about that. What to remove, and that's a very beautiful, another very important thing. And before you get into, so I love art, and some of the most beautiful art is where it's not like when you can add more stuff to that, but when you can't like remove anything else from that. So is that minimum number of things which is there and you can't remove anything else beyond that, that makes it a beautiful piece of art. And I think that's true even in business strategy, that's true in life, because if we are running after too many things, we get little bit of many things, and most of the times we don't achieve our goals. So knowing what's that big focus is, and going with this a pair of scissors, and removing stuff, I love that as a kind of life philosophy. as well as business philosophy. So over to you, Allan. How would you take your pair of scissors and remove stuff from the board meeting or the
Right.
management meeting?
So I want to lead with a joke. There's a famous sculptor, and he produces this beautiful sculpture of an elephant. And the art critic asks him, "How did you do this?" And he says, "Well, you start with a giant piece of stone and you carve away everything that doesn't look like an elephant." So
That's right.
it's that paradigm. It ties into exactly what you're saying. It's that paradigm. And start with all the things that you share with your own team, and then add the things that you share with your peers, and then add the things that you share upstairs to the CEO, and then take all of that and say, how much of this is actually relevant to the board? How much of this is something the board might care about, and is it in the right format and presentation layer? And one of the things I like to do, I call it the double click method, is that you should, once you've started with that, to begin triaging and analyzing what you want, you should begin sifting and distilling and creating less and less. To your point, your goal is less, not more. And let's say you finally come up with your pattern for less. I still like that next level of detail to be available. And this is why I start with the level of detail and hone down to no detail, so that I can go back to detail if needed. My 3 slides for the board might have clickable links, and if you double click them, you can gain the level of detail that you would share with the CEO or the CFO or the CRO at that level, the C-suite. And then maybe there's even more detail that you can double click and see what you would share with your peers around the business, other SVPs and VPs and folks in the business. And then maybe there's another layer where you can get into the really technical detail, the sort of stuff you might share with your own team. I like to have that reductionary methodology to create it, but also to be able to go back to that level of detail as required. And every board is different. You may not actually make it a clickable link. You may just have that information at the ready in your back pocket and not actually put it in the presentation layer. But you should have that model in mind, in my mind. And so start with what you know is too technical. Like if I'm going to share it with my team, the odds are it's far more technical than what I would share with my peers. If I'm going to share it with my peers, the odds are it's a little more technical than what I would share with the C-suite. If I'm going to share it with the C-suite, the odds are it's a little more operational than what I would share with the board. And always have those filters. Is this too technical? Is this too operational? Is this too detailed? Is this even a real metric, right? And one of my definitions for a real metric is sometimes you'll share information with your team or your peers that isn't really a real metric, right? One of the best criteria I had a boss years ago who told me that a metric should only ever be called a metric if something can be done about it. In other words, you're presenting a data point that's a measurement of some kind whose results can be altered by conscious choice, right? If you're simply reporting on metrics, and I know a lot of people fall for this trap, here's how many viruses we blocked last month. Here's how many phishing emails came in that we blocked. Here's how many hits came on the firewall that we stopped. And you're just rattling off all these attempts and all these things that you're already blocking. That number could vary wildly, quarter over quarter, month over month, week over week, day over day. And yet you have no control over it whatsoever. So that's not a metric. That's just a meaningless bit of information. So don't include that, right? Stick with things that you can control. Stick with things that the business can control. When you get up to the board level, it shouldn't be necessarily about you anymore. Stick with that rule about what can be altered and what can be measured and managed and changed, but do it at a business level when you're with the board. Do it at a department level when you're doing it with the leadership. Do it at a security level, when you're doing it with your peers, et cetera, et cetera. So it's always up and down that scale of too much detail, not enough detail, and always up and down that scale of too technical, not technical enough, too operational, not operational enough, and always with the lens of, I want my audience to walk away with a mission or a purpose, or to truly understand what my mission and purpose are with regards to the information I'm presenting.
Great point, Allan. And this is something which we see commonly. It's not really about the number, but it's the meaning of the number, right? A lot of times we just pick up a metric like average. Average could be a good metric, but in certain context, that might be a bad metric. And you might choose median instead of a mean. Mm-hmm. Because if there's a very large data point in the set of numbers, then that suddenly changes the average. Yep. I mean, if suppose Bill Gates is in a bar, then the average wealth of the people in the bar would look something unrealistic, and it's not meaningful. So in that case, instead of taking the average, you take the median. And so depending on the context, depending on what story that you want to tell, the metric changes. So you mentioned a very beautiful point that it's not really about the number, but it's about the meaning and it's about the story. So if we think from that perspective, then we will be able to go and eliminate a lot of those numbers. Any numbers that doesn't have a meaning and doesn't tell a story and is not actionable, like what you mentioned, we remove it. That's a great point. And any other things which you want to, or which you feel are some of the kind of success factors of a successful board presentation or a management presentation?
Never include anything you're not willing to include every single time, right? Sometimes
Great
you're
point.
experimenting with new ideas and you come up with a new chart or a new heat map and it takes you hours and hours and hours and hours and hours to build this thing. And then you go take it and put it in front of the board. Guess what? You're now doing that every single time, right? Never change on the board what you're showing them. Always give them consistency. Always give them the same perspective, the same model, the same measurements, so that when you speak to that high level of here's where we were and here's where we are and here's where we're going, it's all with the same language, the same vocabulary, the same grammar. If you change, always do it with a very conscious mind. Always know why you're changing. Do it based on what was successful and not successful in terms of how it was received. Don't do it just because you can, and don't do it on an experimental basis, and certainly don't do it if the new artifact you're generating is too much overhead to sustain. Always make sure it's sustainable.
It's a great point, Allan. Anything that you do in terms of as a follow through after a board meeting or a management meeting? What do you do post?
Yeah, so presenting all the information ahead of time, we've covered. Covering the information live and being prepared for questions and answers. Always make sure you know what your action items are. You're going to be very busy presenting. Have someone with you who can take notes, because all these questions that get fired at you, you might not remember that you've actually got a commitment. Like I try to have someone else note down what my action items are and what my questions and commitments were and my answers, because sometimes it's flying so fast and furious, I'm not going to remember every detail. I'm too busy being in the moment to be my own historian. And so have someone help with that, and then make sure you follow up. At the end, you summarize and you read the action items, you read the minutes, and you say, okay, I'm on the hook for the following. What is the time period? Because more often than not, when you're asked for a thing, you're not specifying time periods and details there on the spot. If you've got the time after your presentation to do a very quick, okay, this action item, 2 weeks, is 2 weeks acceptable? Okay, I'll have you that in 2 weeks. If you can do that live in the room, that's great. If you can't, that's part of your follow-up conversations as well. I would immediately notify the board, all the members, here's my action items that I walked away with, and here are the time commitments I'm committing to, and see if there's a challenge there. I always try to lead with what I think I can do rather than asking them for something that may end up being unrealistic for me. And I guess that's my best post advice.
Wonderful, wonderful, thanks. So let's close it with the last question around risk. And communicating risk to the board or to the management is something which is, I would say, slightly different compared to what we would do with another fellow security professional, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, how do you measure risk? Again, measuring risk, I consider that as one of those elusive problems like measuring happiness.
Right.
I guess nobody is going to figure it out in terms of that perfect measurement of happiness or perfect measurement of risk. But how do you think we could measure risk? That's part one of the question. And the part two is, how would you communicate that risk to the management or board members?
Right. So the traditional model of the 5x5 matrix, likelihood and impact, and high, medium, low, etc. It's the most popular model. It's a model that many boards respond to well, and it's a model that will resonate with those boards. There are plenty of detractors in our industry who will point out that likelihood impact is a messed up mess. Some people will talk about how the scales are ordinal, and yet some people use it as a multiplicative. In other words, 5 and 5 is 25, not 10. You multiply the numbers instead of adding them, which with an ordinal scale makes no sense, but helps to demonstrate the drama of this is really bad, this is really good. 1 to 25 is a much more pronounced scale. Some people do that and the boards respond to it quite well. Some stick with the standard ordinal and math, and that seems to work well. Some people don't even put the numbers and simply do a heat map. I had one company I worked for where reporting upstairs, was literally just the red, yellow, green heat map, but in a very nice gradient manner, without the numbers, words there, but not numbers there of likelihood and impact, and arrows with the dot and the line and the triangle at the end to show we started here and we got to there. And you can show where we reduced likelihood dramatically, but impact stayed the same, or we managed to partially reduce likelihood and impact both, or whatever. Some boards respond very well to that, just a true heat map without even a whole lot of math behind it at all. And then other proponents are going to tell you that you have to use FAIR. Everyone knows, I think, at this point in the industry what FAIR is, and I'm certainly learning more about it as I go. On my podcast I just released this morning, the author of one of the authors of How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk was on the show. I've got a show coming out in a couple of weeks with a practitioner who has used FAIR to great success. So I'm not anti-FAIR, I'm not anti-Bayesian math, I'm not anti-Monte Carlo sims. I am still learning and exploring in those realms, but trying to fit them into this greater narrative that we talked about. Storytelling is first, data is second. If we can cover the story and supplement with the data, and this is how the board wants to ingest the information, then models like FAIR and Monte Carlo sims and Bayesian math can become far too complex, far too technical, distract heavily. So I know that the author of the book, for example, who was just on my podcast this morning, he mentioned that he uses FAIR for himself in the back room. It's a way of making sure he's got his own head in order, he's got his own math in order, he's got his own facts in order, and he has a high confidence factor of what's going on. And then he presents a much more simplified version of the facts to the board and only has the FAIR model there if he's challenged or asked details about how did you get to this, at which point he can talk about, probability curves and confidence intervals and things of that sort, but never lead with that, never present that. And that's one way to compromise, I think, between the highly measurable approaches that we have out there and the more storytelling oriented, approach that I've discussed with the board. I think that's a nice way to split the difference.
That's a great point. And Allan, I'm an absolute firm believer of the same philosophy, especially when it comes to the board. Now, if you are in the business of insurance, and if you have to measure risk, that's a different game. And I would do a lot of maths in that, because that's where you have huge numbers, right? The number of instances are very huge, and you have to make certain deductions and make a few precise calculations based on which your company's fate is kind of depending on that, right? So that kind of cases, it's absolutely fair to use FAIR, but I think all other cases, and especially for the board members, it would be probably very unfair. So
Unfair to use FAIR.
Yeah, so stories would be a lot more helpful when it comes to the board. So of course, I mean, these tools are great, but using the right tools at the right place, I mean, we shouldn't be kind of running around with the hammer looking for a nail, or sometimes just thinking everything is a nail and hit it with the hammer. So we should use the hammer in the right manner. So that's a very beautiful point made, Allan. So thanks a lot. I found this to be one of the most enjoyable conversation on this topic. I have discussed a lot with many folks. So Allan, this had been really great, and we would thank you for being part of the community, for joining us and sharing your thoughts and insights. Thank you so much, Allan.
Thank you so much for having me, and I hope I added some value, and I'm glad to hear it was an enjoyable conversation for you. It was for me as well.